Hi, everybody. It's Brad Truax at Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. Winter's approaching, and much of our wildlife has migrated away. But winter is actually a good time to see a lot of signs of our wildlife. A lot of animals remain active during the winter. Here's just a list of frequent ones: moose, deer, bobcats, fishers, beavers, rabbits and hares, barred owls, foxes, skunks, coyotes, otters, and many others. Uh, Fresh snowfall is a great time to look for animal tracks. But keep in mind that the tracks often get distorted by the snow as it melts. And the tracks that you're most likely to see in the snow here at Eastman are most often from dogs. But after that, rabbits and hares and squirrels. Those are the three most common tracks that you're going to see in the snow at Eastman. But you may also see bear tracks, bobcat tracks, tracks from foxes and coyotes, raccoons, fishers, weasels, otters, and porcupines, even deer and moose tracks, and even tracks from wild turkeys. Animals in winter have three basic strategies. They either migrate to a warmer area, or they hibernate, or otherwise go into a lesser degree of sleep and reduce their metabolism, or they stay awake and remain active all winter long. So here's some examples. Moving to a warmer area, obviously birds migrate south for the winter, and monarch butterflies fly all the way to Mexico for the winter. The second strategy, reducing metabolism and activity. True hibernation would be sleeping and reducing your metabolism and activity to a real bare minimum. But again, keep in mind that really only bats and groundhogs are true hibernators. And there are lesser degrees of what we now refer to as torpor, where an animal basically goes into a light sleep, reduces its metabolism and its activity. And then the third strategy is keeping awake and active. Our moose stay awake and active all winter, but they actually reduce their activity. So whereas during the summer months, they may have a range of 25 square miles or more, in the wintertime, they usually reduce that range to 1 square mile or less. All animals, regardless of which of those three strategies is taken, have to prepare for winter earlier. If birds or bats are migrating, they have to store up enough energy so that they can make the flight to wherever they're migrating to. A bear develops what we call hyperphagia. That's where they eat basically everything in sight and fatten up so that there's enough fat stores to get through the winter. And groundhogs basically double their weight because they go through the winter without eating at all. Fortunately, there are lots of high energy foods in the forest available in the fall, mainly in the form of what we call hard mast, which are things like acorns and beech nuts and hickory nuts. Squirrels cache nuts for the winter in their nests. Actually, some of them cache nuts in multiple sites as kind of an insurance in case something goes wrong with one of the sites. And blue jays also cache nuts, often very far from where they found them. And chipmunks cache food in the larders in their very extensive burrows. And beavers cache sticks for food at the entrances to their lodge, basically underwater. We'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. And it's not just squirrels that cache nuts. Here's a red-headed woodpecker getting ready for winter and caching an acorn into the top of a snag. Blue jays also are known to cache nuts. Some animals actually change fur color to make it easier to hide in the snow. Examples of this would be weasels and snowshoe hares. And many animals molt and grow new hair that's denser and more hollow so that it can provide more insulation in the winter. Some animals grow fur on their feet, for instance, lynx and snowshoe hares, or they grow extensions on their feet, such as the ruffed grouse, so that they can actually walk on top of the snow. And even birds may grow new feathers and fluff out their feathers to create pockets of air that actually create some insulation to help keep them warm in the winter. And body oils that are secreted also produce some waterproofing, which is particularly important when there's a lot of snow. And examples of oil producing waterproofing would be beavers, deer, and some birds. Uh, Finding a suitable shelter is most important in preparation for the winter. And some animals already have burrows that they can spend the winter in. These would be groundhogs, chipmunks, skunks. Beavers build lodges to spend the winter in. Bats find caves or mines to hibernate in. Porcupines like to den in hollow trees. Bears and bobcats and others tend to make dens in rocky crags or hollow logs or root masses. And mice and other small animals find holes in the ground, but they can also use subnivean tunnels. Subnivean means under the layer of snow, and the snow actually provides them with a certain degree of warmth. And turtles and frogs tend to find deep water that's deep enough so that the ice doesn't reach them, and then they dig into the mud and spend the winter there. And a few frogs actually totally freeze in winter, yet they live. Snakes also huddle together in what we call hibernacula. I mentioned the rocky dens. Bobcats particularly like rock formations for caves that keeps them out of the severe weather. And this bottom one is a bear cave here in New Hampshire. And again, both bobcats and bears can also den in hollow logs or root masses and other areas other than just rocky dens. I mentioned the color changes for winter. Again, some animals change color of their fur in the winter. Weasels and snowshoe hares most common, and they go from brown coats to completely white, except for the tip of the tail in the weasel, which remains black. And it's not the temperature or the snow cover that triggers the change. It's decreasing amounts of daylight that trigger hormonal reactions that cause changes in the production of natural pigment in their bodies. And reduced daylight causes a chemical reaction that decreases levels of dark melanin containing pigments. And being able to blend in with the snow is an asset. But keep in mind, if you become white and there's no snow, you're actually more easily seen. This is showing the top one is a long-tailed weasel in the summer. You can see that he's basically brown. He's got kind of a yellow belly. And in the winter, the long-tailed weasel turns completely white, except for the tip of the tail. And again, this white coat helps protect them from predators, but it also helps hide them from prey. And particularly for the weasel, which is a very fierce predator, uh, being able to hide from the prey that you're stalking is particularly important. This is showing rabbits. Again, the snowshoe hare here in the summer has a brown coat, and in the winter has a white coat. And once again, that white fur helps hide them from predators. Uh, Barred owls blend in particularly well with their surroundings almost any time of year. This is showing a barred owl in the winter. And again, they sit so still that it's very easy to miss them. So if we can't see them, imagine what a small animal like a mouse would be missing. Some animals actually huddle together for warmth in the winter. I mentioned snakes in a hibernaculum, but beavers will also huddle together in their lodges. Deer and bats also huddle together. And rarely a member of another species may join them. So, for instance, a muskrat sometimes joins beavers in a beaver lodge. Winter is also a time for breeding. There are many animals that breed during the winter: beavers, bobcats, skunks, coyotes, raccoons, owls, and probably a few others. And many others have mated earlier, but they get delayed implantation of the blastocytes. So they actually undergo gestation during the winter and give birth during the winter months. This is particularly true for bears and river otters. Uh, Again, the second strategy we talked about is reducing metabolism and activity. Well, true hibernation means going to sleep and reducing your metabolism and activity to a bare minimum. But there are certainly lesser degrees of reducing metabolism and activity, and many more animals actually do that rather than truly hibernate. So, what is hibernation? Again, we said basically it means going into a deep sleep, shutting down your metabolism, and reducing your activity to an absolute minimum. And you survive basically on caloric stores that you built up prior to the winter, mainly fattening up in the fall. So here's an example in bats. Bats actually drop their body temperature down to the high 30 degrees. They drop their heart rate from 200 to 300 beats per minute down to 10 beats per minute. They drop their breathing rate to one breath every 15 minutes. That's just incredible. And there are very few animals that are true hibernators: bats, groundhogs, snakes, and wood frogs. There might be some other ones, but those are the only ones that I know of. But many more go into a lighter sleep like state, which we refer to as a torpor, and they reduce their metabolism and activity, but they're still arousable. Groundhogs are true hibernators. In early June, their metabolism begins to slow, and even though their food intake also decreases, their weight really almost doubles. And they produce fat deposits that they need to sustain them during hibernation and later in winter. And instead of storing food, the groundhogs really stuff themselves in order to survive the winter without eating. So groundhogs are true hibernators, and much like the bats, they reduce their temperature as low as 37 degrees. Their heart rate goes down to about 5 beats per minute. Breathing goes down to 2 breaths per minute. And though their metabolic rate slows, they're still going to lose an incredible amount of weight over the winter. They probably lose about half their weight over the winter. And when they do emerge from hibernation around February, it's only a myth that they can actually predict spring. We'll talk about groundhogs in another video in the spring. Bats in winter have two options. They either migrate, and there are three New Hampshire species that migrate south, or they hibernate. And the other five New Hampshire species hibernate in winter. And that hibernation takes place from November until April. Some might also have a hybrid approach where they do migrate south a little bit, but still hibernate. And this is showing bats hibernating. You can see they hibernate together, pretty much improving warmth. They are true hibernators. They hibernate either in caves or in mines, and they severely shut down their metabolism. We already showed you what happens to their metabolic activity and their physiological activity. But to prepare for hibernation, they have to increase their body weight 25% in the fall. And this is very precise because if they gain more than 25%, they can't fly. So they can't get to the place that they're going to hibernate. So they have a very narrow margin of error. And there are basically two types of bat hibernators: the cave hibernators and the mine hibernators. In New Hampshire, they're mainly cave hibernators. And the hibernacula has a very stable temperature, somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and a very high humidity over 80%. And these conditions protect the bats from freezing or dehydrating during the long winter. Mine hibernators generally migrate elsewhere. White nose syndrome is killing many bats around the world. It's caused by a fungus. You can see here this bat has this white discoloration around the nose. And millions of bats around the world have died due to white nose syndrome. Again, it's caused by a fungus, but very interestingly, the fungus itself probably doesn't kill them. What kills them is that the fungus irritates them and it wakes them up during hibernation. Now, remember, during hibernation, they had almost completely shut down their metabolic activity. So now that they're irritated, they wake up. That increases their body temperature, their heart rate, and their metabolism. And that uses up any fat reserves that they have. And they basically starve before spring arrives. And that shows just how fragile the hibernation state is. Now, bears get ready for winter, we mentioned, by eating as much as food as possible. And during those fall months, the bears eat and drink almost nonstop. We've referred to that process as hyperphagia. And the bears then den up in the winter. Their dens can be in hollow trees or logs, under a root ball of a tree, in rock crevices, or in actual caves. And bears are not true hibernators. Rather, they go into this lighter degree of sleep that we call a torpor, and they conserve energy. And That misnomer hibernation for bears simply means that they don't need to eat or drink or rarely urinate or defecate in the winter. And during their slumber, their bear's body temperatures will drop. Also, their pulse rate and their respiratory rate drops, and their bodies will use up the fat that they stored in the summer and fall. And they'll lose about 25% of their weight over the winter months. The main difference between hibernation and torpor is that during torpor, the animal is able to wake up quickly in order to avoid danger, or if the opportunity exists to exit the den to find some food. So you might see bears in winter here at Eastman. This is showing a bear in 2022 during Fat Bear Week. That happens to be a grizzly bear, but our black bears also tried to beef up. Back in 2022, the food sources were far less than usual in the winter months. So the bears were not putting on as much weight as they usually do. You'll also remember we had a lot of bear encounters here at Eastman, and that was largely because the food sources in the forest were scant that particular year. So we were actually worried that some of them were not going to survive the winter, and probably some of them did not. But subsequent years were what we call mast years, where we had abundant acorns and beech nuts in the woods in the fall. So the bears had lots of food in the forest and were able to bulk up over the winter. So again, the hibernation, which again is a misnomer, is triggered by the decreasing day length and some hormonal changes that happen in the animal that basically tell the animal it's time to conserve energy. And pregnant bears give birth to their cubs in the den, mostly during those first 2 months that they're, quote, hibernating. And the family remains in the den for the duration of winter. The cubs nurse on the mother, even though she's asleep in most cases, and the cubs grow during the winter. And they all emerge in the spring when the snow begins to melt and they start searching for foods, often searching first in the wetlands, which tend to have some of the earliest food sources. This is showing a black bear den. This is showing another bear den. We mentioned they can den in hollow trees. And because they're not true hibernators, they may arouse during winter. And this is a video, courtesy of Mark Kendall, of some bears they saw in a tree den in winter. And there you can see up top is a mama bear. Below is at least one or two cubs. And they're actually awake here in winter. You can still see some snow out there. Bear tracks in the snow. The bears have 5 toes and very wide palm pads. The hind paw has a large heel print. This is actually a hind paw up here, a front paw down here. And you can see that in the front paw, the claws are shorter and the toes are a little bit more separated than on the top. And the heel pad on the front foot is barely showing. You can just kind of see a little bit down here. Our New England winters are getting shorter, and they start later and they end earlier, and we have many more days of that are free of snow cover in our recent years. So as a result, the bears are more out and about in recent years. And that's why we recommend not putting out your bird feeders until there's been snow on the ground for a while. And the old recommendation was always take your bird feeders down between April 1st and December 1st. But with shorter winters, you need to take into account the bear activity when you're making a decision about putting your bird feeder out or taking your bird feeder in. Bobcats can be on the prowl year round. Their coat becomes a lighter gray in the winter, and that tends to blend in with the bare plants in winter, so they're pretty well camouflaged from their prey. They don't mind snow, but they don't really like deep snow. So, so often, if there's a heavy snowstorm, they'll stay in their shelter. Canada lynx, which we don't have here at Eastman, have larger padded feet that help them walk on top of the snow more easily than the bobcat can. So if you're actually in an area that has both lynx and bobcats, the bobcats are at a different disadvantage. Lynx have been seen recently in northern parts of Vermont, and they're probably also present in northern New Hampshire. But we don't have lynx down here. No definite sightings of lynx in the Eastman area. And the bobcat's breeding season is between mid-January and early February, so they often breed during the winter months. This is a video courtesy of Amy Hoffman of a bobcat here at Eastman. And you'll see first she, this is probably a she because they're relatively small, sitting on her haunches. Then she'll have a slow, stealthy gait. And notice the paw placement as she goes. And then also notice that there's a bird feeder. Here's the video starting. She's getting up off her haunches. She's sniffing at some scent there. Then maybe another bobcat left. Okay, now she's going to walk very stealthily. And right there, you can see a bird feeder. Now, that's important. She's not looking for bird seed. What she's looking for are the small animals that might be feeding underneath that bird feeder. So, again, pretty impressive. That's a bobcat in winter here at Eastman. Bobcats like stone walls, and you'll often see them around stone walls. One of the reasons is that small mammals like mice and voles also tend to inhabit those stone walls. So the bobcat likes to be there to hunt those animals. And they also use those stone walls as kind of elevated corridors while they're hunting. But note, particularly in this picture, remember I mentioned camouflage? Well, the bobcat has in summer has a more brownish colored coat. Here, the coat is turned very gray in the winter, and it blends in both with the stone walls and with these branches that no longer have any leaves on them. So, where do bobcats den? Well, they make dens for breeding and storing food, and protection from predators, and protection from the weather. And those dens are also used for rest, sleep, and play. And they especially like to make their dens in rock formation and caves. But they also may den in a hollow tree or a log or a brush pile. And often they'll have multiple dens. And once again, you saw this photo before, denning here to basically to get out of the winter and protect from predators. Bobcat tracks are typical feline tracks. Now, again, we often have to differentiate feline from canine tracks when we're out tracking in the winter. And again, feline tracks typically don't show the claws, and that's because most felines have retractable claws, as opposed to dogs and foxes and coyotes, which typically do show the claw marks. So again, this is a typical feline track. And again, also look at the heel print. There are actually three lobes here, which is characteristic of a feline track, as opposed to only two lobes in the canine tracks. And then you can also notice a halo. There's a rough halo around here. You can see it very prominently down here. And that's because there's fur around the paws, and you're actually seeing an impression of the fur in the snow there. Bobcat track patterns. These tracks were actually left by a bobcat here at Eastman. Sorry about this photo is taken through a screen door, but you can see the tracks here. And notice that there's very little horizontal space between the tracks. The tracks almost appear to be linear. And that's what we call direct registration. And what that means is that as the animal walks, the hind foot actually lands directly on top of the front foot track. So it's called direct registration. You may also see what we call bobcat sit downs. So again, remember this picture in the video, we saw that bobcat sitting on her haunches. So this is a bobcat sitting on his haunches. This is a bigger one. So he's sitting down. You can picture his back paws are underneath him. One front paw is on the ground. The other one may be touching. So again, what you would see in the snow is exactly that. Here are the two back paws that were underneath. Here's kind of the belly and the underside of the bobcat as he was lying down. There's a front paw and another front paw. So again, that's a bobcat sit down. Okay, squirrels also fatten up prior to winter, and they spend much of their time in the winter in their nests or their dens. And they have two types of nests. Some are platform nests, which are up in trees, but the other are cavity nests, which are also in trees, but they're actually a cavity. And the cavity nests actually provide more shelter from the elements in the winters. And squirrels may huddle together in those nests in order to keep warm. And they also generate heat by shivering. And on days below freezing, they may go to sleep in their nests. And again, they'll lower their heart rate, their breathing, and their body temperature, but never to the point of hibernation. So it's more fitting with what we call torpor. And they've cached nuts for the winter, so they spend less time foraging outside in the winter. And gray squirrels may have multiple caches so that there's some insurance in case something happens to one of their caches of nuts. But red squirrels only tend to have a single cache. And you may also see the squirrels in winter underneath your bird feeder because they particularly like the bird seeds that you're putting out for the birds. And this is showing squirrels in a cavity nest. This is in a tree. They prefer live trees for these cavity nests. And often that cavity den is often first created by a woodpecker, and then it's abandoned and later claimed by the squirrels. And natural process to the tree, which this was, can also produce cavities. So there you see two squirrels that are huddling in a cavity nest. And again, the tree nests offer the best protection from wind, rain, and snow, tree cavity nests as opposed to platform nests. And squirrel tracks in the snow. I mentioned previously that after dog tracks, the two most common tracks that you're going to see in the snow at Eastman are squirrels and hares. And again, superficially, they resemble each other. So if you just looked at these, you'd say, gee, they could all be rabbit tracks. But in fact, they're not. This actually shows the difference between the two. The squirrel, when the squirrel walks or kind of leaps, tends to have tracks that are very parallel to each other. Remember, these are the front paws up here. These are the back paws up here, the front paws back here. But with the squirrel, they're very close together. Whereas in the snowshoe hare, they're offset. These front paw tracks are offset. And this is just showing squirrel tracks in the snow. And squirrels have 4 or 5 toes showing on their tracks. More often, you'll see 4 toes on the front and 5 on the back. Remember, this is backwards here. And there's often what we call a 1-1-3-1 pattern. If you look here, you have 1 short toe, 3 long toes, and then another short toe. And again, this is just showing the same thing schematically. Um, and again, the palm pads on the front feet tend to be somewhat triangular in shape, so kind of triangular, whereas the hind pads tend to have more of an arc shape. Chipmunks in the winter live year round, or chipmunks live year round in their very extensive burrows. And they cache food in the larder in their burrows. And they may also do some scatter hoarding as well. They don't really hibernate, but again, they go into this state of a light sleep or torpor, and they remain in their nests until springtime. And their sleeping quarters are kept clear of shells from nuts, and their feces are actually stored in special tunnels for refuge. This is just showing an extensive diagram of a chipmunk burrow, and you can see there are multiple different chambers. They can store some food here. Down here is where they defecate and urinate, and it goes out there. Rabbits in the winter, rabbits and hares are active all winter long, and they shelter underground, and they insulate their dens with grass and straw and twigs. And you actually may be more likely to see them in winter because they have to spend more time outside looking for food. And they need to find tall plants to eat that are sitting above the snow because they don't dig down into the snow to find plants. And rabbit and hare tracks are probably the most common tracks that you're going to see here at Eastman after dog tracks. And we already mentioned that the snowshoe hare's coat turns white in winter to help hide them from predators. But the cottontail rabbits stay brown. So they have to find some thick bushes or evergreen trees or some fences to hide behind so predators can't find them. And snowshoe hares tend to grow more fur on their paws in the winter, and that helps them walk on top of the snow. So this is showing some hare tracks. Once again, you see the hind paws actually come out front, and then the front paws are back here. And as opposed to the squirrel, there's an offset here between the two front paws. And often melting will somewhat obscure the tracks. And I can't tell you how many times we've been out following tracks thinking, oh, this is going to be a much more exotic animal that we're tracking, only to finally realize, yeah, they were just rabbit tracks that were somewhat distorted. Foxes may den in winter, but usually they just curl up out in the open and they wrap their tail around themselves, tuck in their noses, and rest in the snow. And on real cold nights, they may reclaim a den or create a new one. The red foxes have an uncanny ability to find prey underneath the snow. And they have a keen sense of hearing that helps them locate the prey. And interestingly, they use the Earth's geomagnetic field to help them hunt in the snow. Many of their leaps in the snow come up empty, but if they're facing north, they catch prey 75% of the time. That's an incredible statistic. And we're going to watch this video.
The fox. This clever canine has an amazing set of skills. Deep snow covers the black hills of the Dakotas, and hidden under that icy blanket, field mice are stirring. The odds of catching anything might seem hopeless, but not to him. An enormous leap to catch a critter under 3 feet of snow. But how the heck did he do it? He's homing in on something. But it takes immense concentration, and he needs complete quiet. His ears can pick up the faintest scamper from beneath the snow. But there's a catch. He almost always comes up empty-handed, unless he's facing north. But how's that possible? As unbelievable as it sounds, scientists now think he's actually homing in on the magnetic field of the planet, using it to calculate and plot his trajectory. The kind of math missiles use to hit their targets. Just the slightest distraction can throw him off. But if he's got the North Pole in his sights, he's guaranteed a meal nearly 75% of the time.
And then we always find that video just to be incredible. Okay, coyotes remain active year-round. They don't hibernate, and you're more likely to hear them than you are to see them. Coyotes do communicate by vocalizing, by scent marking, and through a variety of body displays. They'll howl to locate their pups or to advertise for a mate or to warn intruders to stay out of their territory. And they mate from January to early March. So they're mating in the winter. And interestingly, you may see this out in the snow. This basically is a little depression in the snow, and there's a little bit of blood associated with some urine colors there. And the blood-tinged urine in the snow is actually from a female coyote who is in pre-estrus, which usually starts during mid-December. And quite often, they're very vocal during mating season. Skunks are not true hibernators. They also will be building up stores in preparation for winter. And in winter, they enter into a torpor or a deep sleep that they can be aroused from, and they become less active with less feeding. But they may be active in winter, so don't be surprised if you see one in the snow. And access to food is probably the biggest driver of their activity. So if there is some food available, they're up and about, and they may become more active during breeding season, particularly from February to April. This is showing a skunk on a video, I'm sorry, on a game cam, and you might see them out in the snow. Porcupines are also active all winter long, but they often stay in their dens or in very cold or stormy weather. And they may den in crevices in rocks, hollow trees, or hollow logs, and any place that there's easy access to a nook. But because they have very short legs, they can't navigate very well in winter in the snow. So they don't wander very far from their dens. And they eat mostly bark and branches from nearby trees in winter. And these are of limited nutritional value. And because of that, they may lose up to a third of their weight during the winter. But very characteristic of porcupines is that they leave scat right outside their den. So again, if they're living in a den in a hollow tree or a rock crevice or a cave, they basically step outside of their den, defecate, and then go back inside the den. So here you see a ton of scat that's located right outside this porcupine den. And this often leads to very large piles of scat. So how about beavers? What do they do in the winter? Well, they live in their lodge. The lodge temperature stays at about 32 degrees. It's very well insulated by mud, snow cover, and the beavers actually warm it up by huddling together, and they use radiating heat. And the beavers store fat in their tail, and they utilize that fat over the winter. Adult beavers will reduce their metabolic rate during the winter, but the younger beavers tend not to. And as we mentioned before, the beavers put piles of sticks under the water at the base of the lodge, and that serves as a food store for themselves and their young all winter long. And the adults go and retrieve these sticks for the young to feed on. And the beavers tend to sleep together in the upper level of the lodge for warmth. And sometimes, as we mentioned before, they'll even let a muskrat in to help with that sleeping together. As a result, single beavers don't do as well in winter as beaver families do, because again, they have nobody to huddle with. And beaver fur is thick in winter, and there's also oil that's spread from their anal glands that makes their fur waterproof. And if there's some open water in winter, they may venture out to eat trees. This is showing a beaver lodge. Again, you see underneath there are two entrances to a beaver lodge. There are several levels to the beaver lodge. On this kind of lower level that's actually just above the water, they will tend to eat and kind of dry off there. And then this is the area that they actually sleep in up here. You can see them sleeping together. Here you see a bigger beaver bringing back some branches to leave here. And again, two entrances below the surface. The chamber above the water level has these two tiers, one for feeding and drying off, and then the upper one is the sleeping one. And again, the cache of sticks is kept below the water line, and they use that as a food source all winter long. The temperature inside the beaver lodge is maintained at about 32 degrees, and that's because it's very well insulated, both with mud and snow. And the beaver bodies are radiating heat. And this one is actually showing mist rising from the breath of the beavers in winter. Um, Interestingly, this lodge was built in one of the polishing ponds here in Johns Glen at Eastman last winter. And it's a bit unusual that it's in the polishing ponds as opposed to another area. But the beavers can also dig canals through the wetlands so that they can basically swim right out to the forest, cut down a tree, and drag it back uh, without getting eaten by a predator, which is pretty good. But they can also swim under the ice to the shorelines and bring sticks back to the lodge. This is showing the polishing pond right next to the one where we saw the beaver lodge last year here at Johns Glen and Eastman. And look at this. You see this long curved line under the ice. And that's actually, we speculated that was from the beavers going out to grab some wood out in the forest, coming back to where the lodge is and leaving those sticks underneath or using the sticks to help build the lodge. And we pretty much confirmed that this spring when once the snow had melted, we were able to see where the beavers came out of the water and crossed another path and went down into the woods, down into Bog Brook. So again, very interesting. Otters are also active all winter long. They're semi-aquatic mammals, so they tend to find a den that's near open water, particularly things like an old abandoned beaver lodge. And their other options are burrows or nooks or even on fallen logs. And they still like the water in the winter, and they have no problem swimming in icy water in winter. And their specialized coat of fur has two layers, one that's essentially waterproof. And they rely on eating crayfish and amphibians, reptiles, and fish from streams and rivers, regardless of the season. And they still love to play, and sliding is one of their favorite pastimes. So we're going to see beaver sliding in the snow. Pretty neat. And again, these are actually slide tracks left by an otter in at Frog Pond here at Eastman. Frog Pond is one of the hidden gems at Eastman. And here's some more otter slides. They like to slide down hills, and very little else could leave tracks like this. You might say maybe a kid on a saucer might leave tracks like this, but these were actually left by otters. And usually they're about 6 to 10 inches wide, and you may see some webbed footprints in the middle of these. And again, otter tracks have this slightly slanted row of 4 footprints, and you can often see a part of their tail dragging across the footprint. Weasels in winter, we already mentioned that the coat of the weasel turns white in winter, which hides them from both prey and predators, and they commonly den in the burrow of another animal. And they often line their nests with the fur and skin of one of the rodents that they've killed. That helps insulate them. And they often cache unconsumed prey in their den and then return to eat it at a later time. Interestingly, unlike almost all other animals in winter, weasels don't bulk up in winter. And that's because they actually have to stay skinny so they can actually fit into the holes of the smaller prey that they're attacking. And because they have very high metabolism, they have to forage often in winter, and they eat about 40% of the body weight daily. And they still primarily eat small mammals like mice and voles, but they can prey on animals that are larger than themselves, such as rabbits. And if you go back to the video that we did on weasels and fishers, you'll actually see the weasels catching some prey that's considerably bigger than themselves. And this is just showing the weasel tracks in the winter. You can look at this slide separately. And they have a bounding gait. So again, sometimes their gait almost looks like rabbit tracks. Fishers are active all year round. Now, even though fishers are members of the weasel family, their coat does not change. And this is showing a fisher caught on a game cam out at night in winter here at Eastman. So they are active year round. And whereas they tend to hunt mostly at night during much of the year, in the winter they tend to hunt during the daytime. So we're actually more likely to see them in winter. And as I mentioned, unlike weasels, their coat does not turn white in winter. In fact, their already dark fur actually becomes denser and darker and glossier in the winter. And they have relatively big feet, which helps them move on snowpacks. And in winter, they use tree cavities, but they also like to take shelter at ground level, like in a hollow log or a space under a rock or some roots or a pile of brush. And they tend to leave scat near the mouth of these dens, much like the porcupine does. And these ground level dens in winter are easier to find in deep snow. And the snow dens consist of tunnels that may lead to a intranivian or subnivian chamber, meaning either within the snow layer or under the snow layer, or to a ground shelter. And we're going to show you.
The fisher visited the hacienda backyard out here in Corbeil near North Bay.
You can see this fisher. This happens to be in northern Ontario. Here the fisher is sniffing at some scent, probably left by another fisher. Now he's going to turn around and actually leave some scent himself. There he goes. He's leaving some scent from the anal glands. There's the bounding gait. They're very curious. And that's a fisher in the winter. Fisher tracks, again, look like this in the snow. And again, here's the front, two front feet. Here are the hind feet. And again, they may have what's called a 2x2 loping pattern. And this is a common track pattern for members of the weasel family. But the track pattern depends on what activity they were in. And again, you can picture what kind of track a fisher that looks like this would leave. He leaves tracks that actually look considerably like snowshoe hare tracks. Ed Sheeran is a wildlife specialist at the National Park Service at Marsh Billings. And he does each year a session on animal tracking that I highly recommend that you follow. And he will look at tracks and picture not only who left the tracks, but what they were doing. So here's an example he gives. These are fisher tracks. So the fisher came up to this open water area, probably took a drink, and then wandered off. Well, here's some more fisher tracks out here. These larger tracks were left by a male fisher, and these smaller tracks were left by a female fisher. So he superimposed a picture of a fisher to imagine what was happening here. So again, she probably wandered back and stopped here. And she's probably sniffing at the scent that was left by a larger male. Now, again, fishers do have scent glands in their paws that leave a scent. So again, this was late February, early March, which is their mating season. So she was probably sniffing at the scent that was left by the male as a sign that he'd like to mate. Raccoons are also active year-round, but you probably see fewer of them in winter. When it's extremely cold, raccoons usually go into a dormant state, and they really slow their metabolism, and they'll sleep in their dens for a few weeks at a time. They do store body fat in preparation for the winter, and they tend to den in tree hollows or rock crevices. And they may also use burrows that were dug by other mammals like groundhogs. And they may den in riverbanks or abandoned beaver lodges. And sometimes they'll seek out shelter in your house or property structures on your property when it gets cold. And then you have to usually call somebody in to help get rid of them. And they'll still raid your trash cans in winter. And this is showing beaver tracks, or I'm sorry, raccoon tracks in the snow. Raccoons have these finger-like projections. They almost look like hands. And they're 5 finger-like toes on both the front and the rear feet. And notice this pattern when they're walking. So again, this raccoon is basically following the tracks that another raccoon left. Deer in winter grow a thicker coat that has some hollow fibers and they're dark brown or gray fur that absorbs more heat and helps insulate them from the cold, and it actually repels water. Their coat traps air under the skin, or I'm sorry, underneath, which helps insulate them. And they also secrete an oily substance that makes the fur water repellent. And deer do become less active and eat less in the winter, so they reduce their metabolism. But they're still eating things like twigs and stems and grasses and other plants. And if they can find nuts, fruits, or mushrooms, they'll also eat that. And much of what they browse is above the snow. Remember, deers tend to browse on things above the ground. And they'll seek shelter from the wind and cold in thickets or under evergreen trees or dense stands of trees that can basically intercept the wind and the snow. And they may also gather together in groups called yards. This is showing a deer yard. In winter, many deer congregate together in a yard, and they'll do this in fields or thickets where some food is still available. And this behavior conserves both body heat and discourages predators. This is showing a deer bed, which is something you might see in the snow, basically a depression where deer slept overnight. And this is showing deer tracks, which typically will show a dew claw. So again, if you look up here, you can kind of barely see a dew claw right here. The deer was going this way, so you're seeing a dew claw. And deer can either walk, trot, or gallop. You may see deer scat in the winter. Deer scat looks like firm little black pellets, about twice the size of rabbit pellets and half the size of moose pellets. This is deer scat on the left. This is moose scat on the right. So you can see it's about half the size of the moose scat. Moose are also active all winter long. They do reduce their activity. And as I mentioned, whereas in the summer they may range up to 25 square miles, in the winter they usually have a range of less than 1 square mile. And because food is less abundant, they lose weight over the winter, even if they don't get tick infestations. And they survive in winter by eating whatever is available, such as moss, lichens, sticks, or bark. And moose have several features that help them get through the winter. They have these very long legs that help them walk through deep snow. Their hooves and their dew claws also help them walk in the snow. I'll show you why in a minute. And their long nose actually warms the air before it reaches their lungs. And they have thick fur to keep them warm and hollow guard hairs, which actually provide further insulation. And unfortunately, winter ticks also love that thick fur to live in. And the winter tick infestations are what are killing many of our moose here in New Hampshire. I mentioned their hooves. They also have these big dew claws. And the combination of these dew claws and the ability to splay their hooves allows them to increase the surface supporting their weight, and it keeps them from sinking in the snow or in the sand. They can also use these big hooves like paddles when they're swimming. So moose are really made for snow. They have these very long legs that help them get through the snow. They have those dew claws and hooves that splay and help support their weight in the snow. And they're really made for the winter. So moose tracks in the snow may or may not show a dew claw. As I mentioned, the deer tracks usually show a dew claw, whereas moose tracks don't often show the dew claw mark. This is showing, remember we showed you a deer bed in the snow. Well, this is a similar one left by a moose, but the big difference is that this is bigger and it also has some blood. And that blood is because this moose was infested with deer ticks, which basically are causing all this bleeding in the coat of the moose. Birds are also present at Eastman in the winter, even though about 85% of our birds migrate south to some degree. We still have lots of birds here. And there's some what we call resident species that are still here year round. This includes woodpeckers, owls, titmice, cardinals, grouse, crows, blue jays, nuthatches, some sparrows, barred owls, and wild turkeys. Here's an obviously blue jay. Here's some cardinals, male cardinal with the brilliant colors. The female has less brilliant colors, but they're here all winter long. Here's a barred owl in the winter. The owls remain active in the winter, and they also breed in winter. And that means you're actually more likely to hear them during winter because they tend to hoot a lot while they're breeding. And because their hearing is so keen, they can easily prey on little animals that are underneath the snow. And their feet are covered with very downy feathers that go all the way down to their toes, and that helps their feet stay nice and warm, even in really cold temperatures. And actually, while most of the owls we have here are barred owls, you may be lucky enough to see a snowy owl in winter because they usually live in places other than New Hampshire in other seasons. But sometimes they're what we call eruptions of this Arctic species when there happens to be an when there happens to be not much of an abundance of their usual prey in some more northern climates. That's a snowy owl. You may see signs of owl activity in the snow. This imprint obviously was left by an owl, and the little critter that was in this little hole is not too happy, but the owl was probably quite happy. So you see a perfect print of an owl in the fresh fallen snow, and it obviously got a small mammal out of that little hole in the center. Climate change may have an impact on the owls, but that impact is not clear. You'd expect that having shorter winters and less snow cover would mean that it'd be easier for them to catch prey. But in recent years, we've seen some problematic cycles here at Eastman. We'll get a snowfall followed by rain, and that leaves a crusty ice on the ground. And we don't like that if we're cross-country skiers, but it's particularly bad for the owls because the owls have difficulty catching mice and voles under that icy surface. And sometimes if we get too much snow, it's actually hard for the owls to get down low and get those mice and voles. Back in the winter of 2007 to 2008, which was a very snowy winter, hundreds of owls were found dead. And they were often hit by motor vehicles. And that was because they were out looking for prey along the plowed edges of roads where they would be much more likely to find some prey. And they were also seen during the daytime during that winter, which was a clear-cut sign that they were being stressed for food. Here's some turkeys on game cam at Eastman in the wintertime. And they're out there looking for food. The wild turkeys are still around in winter. They tend to huddle in dense evergreen trees or dense bushes for protection from the wind. And they'll favor south-facing slopes so they get a little bit more sunlight. And they tend to roost in trees so they're off the ground and less vulnerable to predators like coyotes. And they tend to huddle together in groups with birds of the same sex. So the females are together, the males are together. And they fluff up their feathers in winter to capture some air for insulation, much like some other birds do in winter. The wild turkeys prefer soft mast like crab apples and wild plums, but they can eat hard mast like acorns and beech nuts as well. And it may be hard for them to find food under the snow cover in winter. So actually, wild turkeys can lose about 40% of their body weight in winter but they can survive for up to about 2 weeks without food if they're healthy. But many do die during winter, and during a severe winter, the survival rate might be as low as 55 to 60%. This is showing what turkey tracks would look like in the snow. They have three toes that face forward and one that points backward, but the rear toe doesn't always leave a print in the snow. Crows are also present in the winter. They're here year round, and some consider them to be pests, but they do clean up roadkill. And interestingly, if you hear a lot of them suddenly start cawing, it may mean that there's an animal nearby. Those tracks that I showed you of a bobcat earlier, I found those when I went and saw the bobcat, and I was alerted to it by the fact that the crows all of a sudden started cawing. So again, they can be a sign that there's a larger animal nearby, like a bobcat or even a bear. Unfortunately, we haven't talked a lot about insects in winter. Most insects either burrow into the ground or have a nest in winter, but ticks are still a concern in winter. Ticks are not killed by cold. Instead, they just become less active, and it's still possible that you can be bitten by a tick in winter. So they tend to burrow down under the leaf litter, and it's only when it's below freezing that you can be sure that you're safe from ticks. And climate change has had an impact on our tick population and consequently on tick-borne diseases. Here in New England, our winters have been milder. They're warmer winters with less snow cover. So the ticks are more active earlier and later in the year. And of course, winter ticks find the warmest place of all, the coat of a moose. So as I mentioned before, fresh snowfall is a great time to look for animal tracks, whether you're out hiking or cross-country skiing, or just looking out your window here at Eastman in the winter. Keep in mind that tracks in the snow often get distorted, and the tracks that you're most likely to see here, again, are dogs, rabbits and hares, squirrels, bears, bobcats, foxes and coyotes, raccoons, fishers, weasels, otters, porcupines, deer and moose, and even wild turkeys. So again, if you want to learn more about animal tracking in the winter, I highly recommend that you go to one of those national park workshops. And again, they have a YouTube channel. Here is the URL, which you can click on in the corresponding PowerPoint that will be posted on the Eastman web portal. And again, here's the link to the animal tracking video that I showed you from Ed Sharon. And again, he usually does this each year. And the John Harris State at the Fells usually has an animal tracking session once there's a snowfall. So you have plenty of opportunities to look for wildlife here at Eastman in the winter, and we hope you'll take advantage of that.